In many rural communities, death is followed by a familiar sequence. The body is taken home, relatives gather, a grave is prepared, and the dead are returned to the earth. But in parts of Zimbabwe, burial can become something more than a final ceremony. When a person is murdered, the family may believe that the dead cannot rest until the living have answered for the blood that was spilled. In 2009, in the farming district of Gokwe South, a young man named Moses Chokuda was killed after a confrontation at a business center. His body was taken to a hospital mortuary, where it remained for more than 2 years. During that time, the case moved through the courts, the community turned towards an older system of justice, and people began speaking of a figure on the night roads, a man carrying his own coffin. Gokwe South lies in the middle of Zimbabwe, in the Midlands province. It is a broad, rural district of cotton fields, cattle paths, scattered homesteads, and long stretches of road connecting one business centre to the next. The Sengwa, Sesame, and Munyati rivers pass through the district. In places, the land breaks into gullies and low ridges, while farther away, the outline of Mavarivi Mountain rises above the settlements. The distance between homes is not measured only in kilometers. It is measured in darkness, in the condition of the track, and in whether anyone else is awake along the route. Gokwe is also a place where older customs remain part of practical life. A family may go to the police, attend a court hearing, and still consult a headman or a traditional authority when a death has disturbed the relationship between the living and the dead. That relationship was at the center of what happened after Moses Chokuda was killed. Moses Chokuda was 25 years old. He was known locally as a young man, a quiet description that would later be repeated in stories about him. Mukamana, the young man. The district was tense in the years around the 2008 election. Supporters of the movement for democratic change had faced intimidation and violence in many parts of Zimbabwe, including the Midlands. The dispute that involved Moses took place in this wider atmosphere at Kambasha Business Centre in Gokwe South. On the 22nd of March, 2009, Moses was seized after an argument. 6 men were eventually placed before the courts. 4 of them were accused of taking part in the killing. 2 others, soldiers, were prosecuted for assault. The public record is precise about the violence. Moses was struck with fists, wooden logs, and booted feet. He was forced into the back of a white open truck, his hands tied, and driven away from the business centre. The road ahead led towards Mutaro village, under Chief Namangwe. The truck travelled through the dark towards a homestead belonging to Headman Isa and Bokwan. A witness was forced to lead the way. The route was not a paved road with streetlights or marked junctions. It ran through the rural landscape, where a vehicle's headlights could reveal a fence, a tree, or a person standing at the edge of the track, only seconds before the vehicle reached it. At the homestead, the group continued to beat Moses. The court record later described injuries to his head, chest, and neck. The violence was not a single blow delivered in confusion. It continued after the journey had ended, with several men taking part and others standing close enough to know what was happening. By the time the group left him, Moses had suffered a severe injury to the cervical spine. The damage was so serious that he could not survive the journey to medical care. He died on the way to hospital on the following day. The men who had taken him away did not carry his body home. They abandoned it, and the road between the killing and the discovery became the first unanswered space in the case. On the 23rd of March, Moses's body was found and taken to Gokwe District Hospital. It was placed in the mortuary, a practical room built for the short interval between death and burial. That interval did not remain short. The investigation moved slowly. The people involved were not arrested until the 2nd of June, more than 2 months after the killing. The case then entered the courts, where the evidence had to be reconstructed from a night journey, a rural homestead, and the testimony of people who had been present when Moses was taken away. His father, Gokwe Chokuda, refused to accept a burial arranged before the family had received justice. He wanted the men responsible to be convicted, and he wanted compensation under the customary system that governed a murder within the community. So the coffin remained in the hospital, while the legal case and the family dispute continued around it. At first, this looked like a delay. As the months became years, it began to feel like a presence. The trial finally took place in September 2011. 4 of the accused, Farina Kaya, Abel Mafosa, Edmore Ghana, and Bothwell Ghana, were convicted of murder with constructive intent. Each received an 18-year prison sentence. The 2 soldiers, Obert Gavi and Tiravashoma Morwadze, were found not guilty of murder. They were convicted of assault and received 12-month sentences, suspended on conditions. The distinction mattered in law, but it did not close the wound in Gokwe. A court could identify the men, describe the injuries, and impose punishment. It could not by itself settle what the family believed had been released by the killing. In Shona communities, an angry or avenging spirit is often called an ngozi. When blood has been shed and the obligations created by that death remain unpaid, the spirit is understood to threaten the people connected to the crime. The customary response is known as kuripa ngozi, paying for the blood, restoring the damaged relationship, and allowing the dead to be buried with the matter settled. For Moses's family, the court verdict was one part of that process, not the end of it. By the middle of 2011, Moses had been in the Gokwe mortuary for more than 2 years. The court had not yet delivered its final answer, and his father, Gokwe Chokuda, refused to let the body be buried before the family received justice. In Gokwe, Gokwe described Moses as fighting his own war. He also told people that the corpse still appeared fresh. The coffin was not opened for public viewing, so the detail remained inside the mortuary, passed from the family to attendants, and from attendants to the wider community. 2 rainy seasons had passed over the district. The body had remained behind the same hospital walls, while the widow raised their young son and the case moved from arrest to trial. Each delay increased the distance between the moment of death and the moment at which the family could say goodbye. A mortuary is meant to hold the dead for a short interval. Here, the months had become years, and the body itself had become part of the dispute. Until payment was made, the family would not allow the burial to happen. The first attempt to take Moses away would turn that belief into something physical. Police officers tried to remove the coffin from the mortuary and arrange a burial without the family's participation. Gokwe later said that about 10 officers gathered around it, lifted together, and found that the coffin would not move. The object had been made to carry one body. It should have been manageable for a group of adults. Instead, the metal remained fixed inside the mortuary, as though the floor had taken hold of it. The attempt ended in another story. Blood was said to have splashed across one of the policemen who tried to force the removal. The detail changed the coffin from a stubborn weight into a warning. It was not merely difficult to carry. It was resisting the people who had come to take Moses before the family had agreed that he could leave. The police withdrew. The body remained behind. For the people of Gokwe, the failed removal gave the dispute a new shape. Gokwe was no longer only refusing a funeral. The coffin itself appeared to be refusing the police. And inside the hospital, A second report was beginning to circulate. Mortuary attendants told members of the Chokuda family that they sometimes saw Moses sitting on top of his metal coffin. The report placed him inside the hospital, but not inside the box. The lid remained below him, the body that should have been hidden beneath it, somehow occupying the space above it. The image was simple, and for that reason, it stayed in people's minds. A dead man, upright, perched on the container that had been waiting to take him home. The mortuary attendants were not searching the roads for a ghost. They were doing the work that had to be done when another body arrived. They knew which room held Moses, and they knew how long his coffin had remained there. If the story was repeated, it was because the same object could be recognized each time: the metal coffin, the sealed body, the place where it was kept. From that point, the hospital was no longer just where Moses had been stored. It became the first place where he was believed to have moved. Then the reports became more direct. A further report from the mortuary was darker still. When attendants brought in the body of another victim of violence, Moses' corpse was said to have spoken to them and indicated the proper place where the new body should be put. The new arrival was another victim of violence. In the report, the mortuary had become a room where the dead accumulated, and Moses was said to have recognized one of them. The voice did not announce itself to a crowd. It was heard during the ordinary handling of a body. The story placed the sound inside the mortuary, among the bodies waiting to be claimed. A dead man, sealed in a metal coffin, was said to have given instructions about another dead man. That detail changed the meaning of the room. It was no longer only a place of storage. Moses had become an active presence within it, aware of the bodies brought in after him and concerned with where they were placed. In the community's understanding of ngozi, an avenging spirit returned with a grievance and pressed the living towards an answer. The voice, if heard, had a purpose. It was not wandering. It was directing attention back towards the dead. Moses had been seen above the coffin. Now he was being heard inside it. Outside the hospital, the reports moved into the open country. Tavanwas said he received word that people connected to Moses' death had seen him alive at the farms of the Ghana and Micaiah families, herding cattle that belonged to the men linked to the killing. The figure was not said to be hiding in a ruined place. Moses was moving through the ordinary property of the people connected to his death, passing among cattle and fences as though the years in the mortuary had not happened. The choice of location gave the sighting its force. These were not anonymous fields. They were the farms of families tied to the case, and the cattle were said to belong to the men whose names had remained attached to Moses' death. At the same time, people spoke of seeing him near the hospital, carrying his own coffin. A dead man was upright, the coffin was above him, and the object that should have marked the end of his journey had become the thing he carried along the roads. The reports gave Moses more than one route through Gokwe. He could appear at the farms, at the hospital, or on the roads between them. The disturbance reached the justice system as well. A magistrate who had first handled the case and granted bail to the accused was said to have developed serious psychiatric problems, losing his mind for days and later roaming the streets of Gokwe. For the people who repeated the story, this was another form of pursuit. The official who had allowed the accused to return to their families was now unable to remain within ordinary life. The report appeared while the case was still moving through delays, appeals, and renewed hearings. It gave the community a way to read the legal process as part of the haunting, rather than as a separate answer to it. The four principal accused were eventually sentenced to 18 years. The legal process had reached its conclusion, but the stories around Moses did not treat a prison sentence as protection. In the traditional understanding of ngozi, punishment by the state and danger from the dead could exist at the same time. The men who had struck Moses could be locked away. The families connected to them could still be exposed. Gokwe stories said that Edmore Garner and Abel Mafosa were tormented by what they had done until they turned towards God. The fear did not end with the men who had been convicted. It reached their relatives and the homes that carried their names. In Shona tradition, an ngozi can bring sickness, sudden death, attacks, or misfortune upon the household of the person who spilled the blood. It continues until responsibility is admitted, compensation is paid, and the damaged relationship is restored. The traditional process could involve livestock, money, grain, public acknowledgement, and ritual action. The exact demand was shaped by the family and the local authorities, but the purpose was consistent. The living had to recognize the life that had been taken. This was why the cattle mattered. They were not simply money after a long legal dispute. They were the visible form of an obligation between families. Prison addressed the state. Payment addressed the dead. As long as that debt remained open, no one linked to the killing could be certain that the matter had ended. By 2011, the dispute had become associated with the condition of Gokwe itself. Chiefs from the area were understood to have asked for intervention, saying that the killing and the delayed burial were followed by drought and erratic rainfall. The appeal carried weight because Gokwe was known for its cotton harvests. When the rains failed or arrived at the wrong time, the loss was visible in the fields and in the households that depended on them. People began to connect the weather with the body in the hospital. The chiefs were said to have sought help from the national leadership, asking for the standoff to be resolved. A matter that had begun between two families was now being discussed as a problem affecting an entire district. A local official later described how everything bad around the ward had been blamed on the avenging spirit. The murder had moved from a case involving named men to a shadow over crops, cattle, and the next season's rain. The longer Moses remained unburied, the larger the territory of the dead appeared to become. By October, Chief Misek Njelele began the negotiations that would decide whether Moses could finally leave the mortuary. He spent 3 days bringing the two families towards an agreement. The first public demand had been 15 head of cattle. By the time the burial was arranged, the settlement discussed in public had grown to 35 cattle and $15,000. 20 cattle and money were delivered first, with the remaining animals to follow. To someone outside the tradition, the settlement could look like compensation added to a criminal sentence. In Gokwe, it was also the act that would restore the relationship damaged by bloodshed and allow the dead to be released. The final negotiation included the funeral itself, the coffin, the food, and the practical arrangements required to bring Moses home. The hospital could not end the standoff on its own. The chiefs had to decide what the living owed, and the family had to accept that the obligation had been met. Only then could the coffin leave. After the first cattle and money were paid, the police coffin was removed from the mortuary. The remains were placed in a plastic bag before the relatives collected them, and the family then spent about an hour alone with Moses. For the first time since 2009, the body was no longer being held by the hospital while other people argued over its release. The change was stark. The metal box that had dominated the dispute had been replaced by a far more fragile container. The family now carried what had been kept behind the mortuary walls. That hour was the quietest stage of the entire case. There was no courtroom, no chief speaking for either side, and no police attempt to force a decision. There were only the relatives and the remains they had fought to bring home. The payment had been made, the chief had brokered the agreement, and the dead man could finally be taken to the funeral at Chipero village. At the family home, Moses was placed in state before the burial. His widow and their young son were left with the final hours of a death that had remained unfinished for more than 2 years. The house had been part of the dispute. Even when the coffin was at the hospital, the family had refused to accept a funeral arranged by strangers and had insisted that the men responsible acknowledge what they had done. Now the cattle had arrived, the money had been paid, and the chiefs had completed the negotiation. The family home became the last waiting place, where relatives could receive Moses before the public burial. The hospital had held the body, the court had held the accused, the house held Moses until the procession could begin. Only one act remained: to take him to Chipere village and place him in the earth. Moses Chokuda was buried at Chipere village on the 22nd of October 2011, more than 2 years after his death. The burial followed the convictions, the compensation, and the traditional negotiations. The wider community watched the event that people believed would determine whether the spirit had finally been appeased. The funeral was also the first public moment in which every part of the dispute stood together. The court sentences, the cattle, the money, the chief's mediation, and the body that had waited in the mortuary. Chief Njelele later said that the matter had come to rest. Headman Kali Mashiza maintained that avenging spirits were real. Oba Chinyama said that people in his ward felt they could finally rest. Their statements treated the burial as more than the disposal of a body. It was the community's final judgment on whether the obligations created by the killing had been answered. Once the ground closed over Moses, the long dispute had a place to end. That is all for tonight. If you want more true stories and chilling encounters like this one, subscribe to Stories After Dark, and we will be here waiting.